Hello again, fellow Mystery Files. Today I'm ranking all 11 Lord Peter Wimsey novels written by Dorothy L. Sayers, one of the queens of crime, probably the second most famous queen of crime after Agatha Christie. And I have a love-hate relationship with Lord Peter Wimsey. I find him occasionally obnoxious. He does tend to come across as very haughty and elitist, which is also what I find so endearing about him. It's his character. Sayers intentionally draws him in this way. So while I personally wouldn't like Lord Peter if he were a real person I met, I very much enjoy reading him. And as a whole, I find these 11 novels to be very strong. I will say my biggest knock in general would be that I don't always enjoy physically reading these books. I love the mysteries and the characters within. I love thinking about them and discussing them, but the act of reading them can be tedious. Sayers tends to be very, very descriptive with very long passages. Sometimes a single paragraph can last for pages. And there are often times when she writes dialogues for lower class and non English people in very heavy dialect that slows down the read considerably. I don't mean to say these are poorly written, slog, or boring, but her writing style does tend to elongate what are already fairly lengthy novels. But she does everything else so masterfully. And before I begin, make sure you like this video and subscribe to the channel. And fair warning, there may be spoilers ahead, but I will warn you when one is coming. Starting out, as always, at the bottom with number 11 is a novel I wouldn't say is terrible. I don't think any of these books are atrocious, although this one I have many issues with, and I didn't really consider any other book for this spot, and that is The Five Red Herrings. Of all the books I placed at the bottom of their list thus far, I think this one has the best plot. I wouldn't say it's the best of the worst books, but it has the best plot. And I love this plot here where we have a murdered painter named Sandy Campbell who is very much hated and definitely murdered by one of six other painters in the area. This puzzle is so masterfully done. The murder, and this is not a spoiler, finished Campbell's painting to throw off the time of death, so there's a lot of looking around for who could have emulated his style. Sayers really dots all her I's and crosses her T's here. The mystery is expertly crafted. The problem is there are many issues with this book regarding all the other aspects of this novel. I find this book to be at times unreadable. As I mentioned earlier, Sayers has a lot of dialogue, and this book is set in Scotland, and there are just so many passages in like broken English that becomes unreadable at times. I have to read some passages multiple times to figure out what is going on and what information is being conveyed. This book also focuses way too much on the mystery, which is a weird complaint for me, but this is a case of the puzzle just devouring everything else. It's too much of the puzzle. It's well crafted, but at the expense of things like characters. And the six artists here are basically indistinguishable from one another. And Lord Peter and Bunter are just there. I don't feel as if they really shine in this book. They merely feel there to advance the plot, and because this book needed a detective. There's a lot of deciphering of train times, which I always found to be one of the most tedious clues in any mystery novel. It's just so boring and it goes on for way too long. And what really places this one in last place for me, in addition to those other things, is that this book does not play fair. We are told in this book that something is missing from Campbell's easel, and Lord Peter knows what it is, but we are not told what it is that's missing. The narration is withholding information from us, and it does make the point that, well, the reader doesn't need to be told this and could figure it out on their own. But the point stands that Lord Peter knows something that we do not and is keeping it from us. That's unacceptable. And there's such an easy way around this too. That's what's so frustrating about it, is that it's totally unnecessary to write the story this way. And the Five Red Herrings has a very strong puzzle, but a multitude of faults that the other books just simply don't have. So it has to come in at last place here at number 11. Number 10 is a book that I feel quite similarly about, but it's a much easier read and plays fair, and that is The Nine Tailors. And I also feel remorseful putting this book this low on the list given how much effort Sayers puts into writing this book. She wanted every detail to be precise and accurate, that she actually delayed sending it to her publisher because she wanted it to be just right. but I think this is a case of Sayers doing it too well. I have similar criticisms sometimes about Niall Marsh, who also got bogged down in details on occasion that just became tedious, and she sort of lost the big picture of the novel. The Nine Tailors is the church bell book. There are so many church bells. It almost feels as if Sayers was writing a college level textbook about the history of church bells and then decided to throw in Lord Peter Wimsey. I think she expertly conveys what she wants and does an excellent job of giving us this history and the stories of these bells, but it's a lot of bells. And each chapter begins with a quote from bell ringing guys. It's just too much. Now, I think the mystery is fairly strong. We have an unknown dead body showing up in another grave, and I've always liked this kind of plot, and I think the murder itself is very good. I'm not the biggest fan of all this like jewel theft heist that goes on here, which really does consume much of the novel, not dedicated to bells, but it is related to the murder at least. I'm not a big fan of ciphers, which feature in this novel as well. I think a mystery novel is not the correct medium for deciphering codes. I know personally I'm not going to spend any time trying to decode things while I'm reading. I did enjoy the story here, but I felt Lord Peter and Bunter weren't at their best. I think this book falls squarely in the category of novels that I enjoyed the story, but I didn't find a particularly interesting read. And the final thing to note with this book, and spoiler alert here, but there isn't actually a murder in this book. The quote unquote murderer is the bells themselves, which I find relatable as I felt like I was being murdered by the bells whenever I read this book. But again, there is also this like speculation that bells wouldn't have actually killed the victim in the manner Sayers describes. There are other books from her that have these issues as well, but I will defend Sayers here as I believe the bells could have killed the victim. Sayers researched these bells so much that I have full faith that she was accurately depicting the situation, and it is a very believable plot. But this book has a litany of other issues, so I have it here at number 10. At number 9, I have a book that I just referred to when I mentioned that some books have scientific issues, and that is Unnatural Death. And this book is one that I think is better than my analysis of it will appear. It is heavily flawed, however. And we have a situation of an elderly woman who dies, and it's unknown if she was murdered or died a natural death. The plot, and this may be a theme here, is very good. It held my interest the entire time, and Sayers didn't have to dive into side plots and what have you. Sayers rarely goes into like red herring territory, which I find commendable. Plot wise, this book is the typical mystery novel. I don't have many issues with the story itself. This is the first appearance of Miss Clemson, whom I always loved. She only makes two appearances, but both of them are spectacular. But the issues with this book are particularly bad. I did consider putting it even one spot lower on this list. I found both Lord Peter and Bunter to be fantastic. I love the scene where Lord Peter is being seduced, which is a lot of fun. Let's talk about Bunter, who didn't make my top 10 sidekicks list, which I regret. I didn't include him because he's not featured a lot. I'm always wanting more Bunter in these books. He's a respectable gentleman. He's based loosely on Jeeves, but I find Bunter to be much less of a character type. He's never the typical servant, although he certainly can be when he wants to. And I'm going to spoil the who, how, and why for Unnatural Death here, so skip ahead if you don't want to be spoiled. But the solution to this mystery is both offensive and inaccurate. It's like a double whammy here. Our victim is Miss Dawson, who died intestate. She was murdered by her great niece, Mary Whitaker, for convoluted legal reasons that reflected real life changes that are extremely nuanced, and I won't get into it here. But Mary murders her by injecting air into her arteries via an empty syringe. This is not scientifically accurate, as it would require an apparatus much larger than a typical syringe to induce death in this manner. And also, Sayers writes that she injects it into a vein when it should be an artery. So this is like another double strike against this book. This is a rare misstep for Sayers, who I feel very often goes out of her way to make her stories feel extremely credible. An equally large, if not larger, strike against this book is the depiction of Mary Whitaker, who is very clearly a lesbian. It's not outright stated, but it is strongly implicated. And when she kisses Lord Peter, she practically throws up, which I found humorous. And I don't have a problem with a lesbian murderer. But Mary here is depicted as a groomer, which is, terrible. And Sarah really plays up this element of homosexuals being deviant and leading innocent young people astray. And this is really a disgusting stereotype. Mary very clearly is manipulating her friend Vera and later kills her. And it's so typical of like homosexual stereotypes and deviancy one would expect in 1927. It's not good and it leaves a very bad taste in my mouth. I do find some aspects of Unnatural Death good, but it has some major flaws that I can't put it any higher than here at number 9. One last note on Unnatural Death that I'm inserting here after I originally recorded, but is the title is also pretty bad. I don't think this title necessarily refers to the original murder of Miss Dawson. I think it refers to the murder of Vera, which is unnatural, quote unquote, in a romantic sense between two women. So I think that's another little disgusting dig there at homosexuals that really, could have done without, and also leaves a pretty bad taste in my mouth. Number 8, and we're getting into the novels now that I would consider to be pretty good. And here at number 8 is the very first Lord Peter Wimsey novel celebrating its centennial year this year, and that is Whose Body? And this is the quintessential unknown corpse novel. It's a classic of detective fiction, and it's also chillingly dark, which is something I didn't expect the first time I read this, because it's also overly humorous. Like many first novels, this one has a lot of like early installment weirdness. Lord Peter is way over the top, even more so than usual, but he's still very enjoyable. And the mystery here is fantastic with this unknown body popping up in a bathtub. And Lord Peter's investigation into this murder is great. He's extremely active in this one. And the solution relies heavily on physical clues, which are more common in Lord Peter Wimsey books than books from the other Queens of Crime. And I do find the writing in this one to be a little inconsistent and sloppy, as aren't always like clear transitions. And in general, I find it's not very organized or clearly explained at points, but it is not such a big deal here. And there's a bit of uncomfortable anti Semitism in this, nothing atypical for this time. And it's not even really like anti Semitism, it's more like just like uncomfortable talk about Jewish people, not necessarily in a discriminating manner, but it can certainly read that way. And I believe newer versions of this book cut out some uncomfortable talk about Jewish men in regards to like a very specific physical feature they may have. And this provided like originally an important clue in this book, which, I understand. It's not like an anti Semitic trope, but it's been removed and it's very uncomfortable anyway. And I'll just say that and leave it there. I really enjoy the solution to this book. It's insanely clever. It's a bit over the top, but not really more so than the other titles of its day. I don't think this book does anything like exceptionally well, which is why I didn't place it any higher than here at number 8. At number 7, a book I enjoyed a lot but thought could use some work, and that is Murder Must Advertise. And this is the book Sayers hashed out very quickly when she was writing the Nine Tailors because she needed to submit a manuscript and Nine Tailors wasn't going to be ready in time. And I like this book more than the Nine Tailors, obviously. Reading Lord Peter use his alias middle names of Death Breeden to work undercover in an ad agency is just so much fun. I wish the entire book was just Lord Peter's exploits at this ad agency and him masquerading as the Harlequin at drug fueled galas. Sayers worked at an advertising agency, so she is able to accurately depict the setting here, and I love it. It is the novel's strongest selling point. We're not like initially told Lord Death Breeden is Lord Peter Wimsey, but if you're familiar with him at this point, you would recognize those as his middle name, and it does eventually tell you. It doesn't. It's not like a situation like Color Scheme where we found out Roderick Allen was like one of the characters the whole time. We didn't told that until like the last page. But Lord Peter is undercover at the ad agency to investigate the murder of his predecessor, who fell down like what appears to be like a very dangerous staircase, as people fall down it all the time. And the first half of this book is very strong and very entertaining. I think the second half dips a bit. I wish this novel's murder plot involved the ad agency instead of going into like drug smuggling rings, which I found to be disappointing. Also, there's more ciphers in this one. It's better ciphers and more interesting than in the Nine Tailors, but and it's still a good story, but it's just not like where I would have preferred this novel went, considering the beginning parts of it. I think Lord Peter is really at his best here. I mean, seeing him work a real job was just delightful, and seeing him interact with this like ridiculous advertising slogans was just so much fun. He tries to like come up with some of them his own. It's hilarious. And we don't get Bunter or Harriet Vane in this book, but we do get Charles Parker and Whimsy's sister Mary, and they're a lot of fun in this one. And Parker gets beat up because Lord Peter uses his address for Death Breeden's address. And I think this book is delightfully, and it's a delightful read with a strong mystery, but it just didn't have the most satisfying ending for me. So I have it here at number 7. At number 6, and it's appropriate this one is smack in the middle of the list because it's probably the book I think about the least, and that is the second book in the series, Clouds of Witness. And this is a great second novel. Lord Peter becomes the character we all know and love in this book. The writing is tighter than Whose Body. Sayers improved in every way over Whose Body with this novel. This is the book that highlights Whimsy's family the best. This is essentially the story of Whimsy's sister Mary and his brother Gerald, the Duke of Denver. There's a lot of Charles Parker in this one as well, and he becomes criminally underutilized in future books. Our victim here is Lady Mary's fiance, Captain Cathcart, and the prime suspect is Gerald, Lord Peter's brother. We're introduced to the Whimsy family dynamics here. I mean, we did see it a little bit in Whose Body, but here it's full on full display. I find each of these characters is wonderfully depicted in their dialogue and their actions. We have Gerald, very much this stuffy, aristocratic noble with the typical rich man skeletons in his closet. I always get a kick out of his anger when people like simply don't take his word that he's not a murderer. And Gerald's wife Helen is just awful. I mean, Sarah constantly uses her as a punching bag whenever she appears in a book. And then we have Mary and Peter, who are more relaxed in their views. Mary is willing to break protocol and tradition, and Peter, never really cared to begin with. And plot wise, not so much mystery wise, this book reminds me a lot of The Mysterious Affair at Styles, where there's a lot of the same things going on. I think for me, Clouds of Witness just doesn't stand out as much as the top 5 books, which I think are spectacular. The ending of this book does border on the ridiculous with Lord Peter making this heroic and overdramatic transatlantic flight. And this is pre Lindbergh, which would make Lord Peter the first person to fly across the Atlantic. It's all just like completely ridiculous. And the ending to the mystery is fine. I don't have a problem with that, but there are some small issues just here and there that land Clouds of Witness here at number 6. Number 5, and 4 of the top 5 novels explore the relationship between Lord Peter and Harriet Vane. And at number 5 is another unknown corpse novel, Have His Carcase. This is the second book to feature Harriet Vane, and the first where we are able to see her as herself and not as an accused murderer. She's contemplating life and trying to move on from the events of Strong Poison and Lord Peter's insistent proposals of marriage. I think this book has some more lows than Clouds of Witnesses, but much more highs and better highs. I really enjoyed the mystery here, and I love the somewhat awkward dynamics between Harriet and Lord Peter as they investigate the murder of this corpse that just washed up on shore. I find the one time characters in this one to be fascinating. I absolutely love the hotel gigolo, and that's essentially what he is. I will say some passages in this book go on for a little too long. Harriet's initial trek after she discovers the body goes on for like way too long. It's significant to the story and well written, but it is a little tedious and you just want to like hurry up and wrap it up. I feel the same way about the narration about how Lord Peter identifies the body via shaving razors. Like that just was too much and too specific. And I'm going to spoil some key plot points here, but not who the killer is. But the twist that the victim thought he was an heir to the Russian throne didn't really stick for me. It wasn't a total miss either because history is full of pretenders to the throne, especially like the Russian throne, and people claiming to be like Anastasia and having delusions that they're royals. I felt Sayers wrote it well and made it believable. She did a good job with it, but it's just like not the kind of revelation that I find to be like top notch. I did like the twist that the victim had hemophilia, as that was very fitting to the Russian theme and also served as an important clue. But overall, this is a very strong novel. It does have some issues that the top 4 don't really have, so I placed Have His Carcass here at number 5. At number 4, and these are the true top tier of Lord Peter Wimsey novels for me. And at number 4, I have Gaudy Night, which I would consider to be like the main Harriet Vane novel. This book is much more Harriet than Lord Peter, and that is not a knock against it. Lord Peter does come intermittently into the story, but this book is based largely on Sarah's time as a female student at Oxford. She was one of the first women to graduate from Oxford, and her experiences in dealing with the opposition to educating women is a major focus of this book. Harriet Vane returns to her alma mater to attend the Gaudy Night reunion, where she receives a poison pen note ridiculing her for the events of Strong Poison, which is a novel I'll get to shortly. There are a number of incidences of vandalism, poison pen letters, a professor's work being destroyed, things like that. There is no murder in this book, nor is there even a dead body. This book's mystery is solely focused on who is committing these actions against the university. Harriet is the main investigator, although Lord Peter does wind up getting involved towards like the back end of the story. I found Harriet really came into her own in this book, whereas in Have His Carcase, she needed Lord Peter to help solve that crime. Here, she also needs him, but she's much more independent and more reliant on herself than on him. Lord Peter is her companion here, and not the lead, so to speak, of the investigation. This book heavily explores their relationship, which I found to be a little unsettling. He's constantly proposing to her, and she just keeps rejecting him. I never found their courtship, and I do use that term loosely, to be that intriguing. I wouldn't go as far as to say Lord Peter is stalking Harriet, but he does come very close and comes off a little creepy at times. He understands she does not want to marry him, but he's just very insistent. And then Harriet begins to relent. It almost seems unwillingly, but not exactly that way. She does feel somewhat indebted to him for essentially saving her life, but has been resistant to get romantically involved with someone after Strong Poison. She speaks with Lord Peter's nephew to gain some insight, but she does come around willingly. I think we're supposed to be rooting for her to say yes to Lord Peter, and I think when she does accept, she does want to marry him, but the journey there is a strange one. I never found compelling. I always found the courtship between Roderick Allen and Agatha Troy to be vastly superior and more interesting than this one. But in the end, I do feel Harriet is in love with Lord Peter, and he didn't, force her into marriage. But back to Gaudy Night. I think this book is probably the best mystery novel that doesn't have a murder, or at least doesn't have a body. This is extremely difficult to pull off, and Sayers does it expertly. I'm going to spoil the end here a little bit, but what makes the story pay off is the solution. The culprit behind this plot to ruin a women's college education isn't a man, it's a woman. And this isn't surprising from a plot perspective, as there are barely any men in this book, and the men who do appear are mostly beloved recurring characters, but it still comes as a surprise to the reader, especially in the present day, I would think. But Sayers experienced this in real life. There were many women who opposed educating other women, as they thought women belonged in their set domestic roles. We saw this like even later in time with like the feminist movement, where some of the biggest opponents to it were women, like, Phyllis Schlafly. So to have the culprit be a woman in this, Sayers is bringing to life her own experiences and tricking the reader in a genius way, because you're not really suspecting a woman here, even though almost everyone in the book is a woman. And it is mentioned in the book that, like, maybe a woman is doing this, but Sayers really leads the reader to think there's some other motive going on besides damaging the university, like a personal motive against certain people. But Gaudy Night is a spectacular mystery novel, though not a murder mystery novel, so it lands at number 4. Number 3, and this is probably Sayers' best known whimsy novel, and might be the one a lot of people might think would be at number 1, but I have it a bit lower, and that is Strong Poison, which is the first novel to introduce Harriet Vane. This plot is so well known. Harriet is on trial for the poisoning murder of Philip Boyce, her lover. The relationship between Harriet and Philip is reminiscent of a real life relationship Dorothy Sayers had with a man named John Cornos, who very much believed in free love and free sex, which Sayers, being highly religious, was not into. And you can make whatever commentary about how relationship and attitudes towards sex have changed since the 1920s, but Sayers felt pressured to lead this lifestyle she was uncomfortable with. And in the novel, Harriet was basically tricked by Philip into having this sexual and free relationship because he told her he didn't believe in marriage. but then he proposes to her, and then she dumps him because she realizes she was made the fool of. She's arrested for his poisoning, and Lord Peter takes up her desperate cause because he wants to marry her, which I always found creepy, but it isn't unlike, Roger Sheringham in the Witchford poisoning case, or Dr. Peter Lord, which you might notice the similarity to that name there, in Sad Cypress. I love this book. I actually think this is probably the best quality Whimsy novel. I love this scene where Miss Clemson has this fake seance. It's one of my favorite scenes in any mystery novel. I love the characters in this one as well. All of them are wonderful, from Lord Peter and Harriet to Parker and the other one time characters. But the reason why I don't have this at number one, and I could not put it at number one, is because of the solution. And I'm going to spoil it here, but our killer who murders Philip for the classic reason of inheritance is an arsenic eater. And I hate this solution so much. I love the mechanics of it. I think Sayers wrote a brilliant mystery here, including the solution. And she is playing fair. It's just that we know nowadays that one does not build up immunity to arsenic by eating small doses of it, at least not with having any very obvious symptoms of arsenical poisoning. And I won't knock her for breaking the rules because Sayers thinks she is playing fair here. Like, she intends to play fair. But I had to move it down because the plot just doesn't work. But she executes it brilliantly, with Philip's cousin eating from the same poisoned food, establishing his own alibi, and being able to frame Harriet, and also obscuring how Philip was poisoned. It really is a genius plot, but I couldn't put it at number one, especially since the top two books are also fantastic and don't have this issue. And the book ends with the hero not getting the girl, which I appreciated. This feels so much more real and fresh and unpredictable than the norm, where, the story always ends with the couple getting together and getting married. And that's not what happens here, at least not for a number of books later. So I do have Strong Poison here at number three. At number two, and this wasn't too tough a decision, but I did debate it a little bit. But I have here at number two the final Lord Peter Wimsey novel written by Dorothy Sayers, Busman's Honeymoon. The title playing off the traditional Busman's holiday, where the detective winds up working while on vacation. The beginning of this book is the best beginning of any Lord Peter Wimsey novel. It's a series of letters detailing the days leading up to and including the wedding of Harriet Vane and Lord Peter, mostly from Lord Peter's mother, the Dowager Duchess's perspective. She's helping the couple escape the press and deals with Helen, Gerald's sister, who is so humorously awful in this. And she's constantly bashing Harriet as unfit for the family and wonder like if Peter's gone insane. She's constantly ridiculing Harriet for many petty reasons, but mostly because she's been on trial for murder, which, I mean, Helen has seemingly forgotten that her own husband was once on trial for murder. This section is a lot of fun. But then we get to their honeymoon, which they spend in Harriet's old village after purchasing a large house called Tallboys, where the original owner is found dead in the cellar. And I love how masterfully Sayers is able to kill two birds with one stone here. She tells the murder mystery story, she integrates it with the story of Harriet and Peter's dawning domestic life together. And she even begins this novel with a comment about how, like, oh, people are sometimes mad that she inserts romance into a mystery novel, and then wonders, like, well, do people get mad when there's a mystery inserted into a romance novel? And this novel is sort of an answer to that. The way they have to operate in their new home mixes with the murder plot so well here. Their domestic life is now embroiled in murder. Lord Peter is upset about this because he wanted to keep this hobby away from his personal life and he doesn't want to upset Harriet. And Harriet, for her part, doesn't seem to mind, although she does have concerns, in particular about how they consummated their marriage in the dead man's bed when he was still, like, keeled over in the basement, or in the cellar, rather. And I find this book so much fun as well. I mean, Bunter is delightful here as he's worried about how he's going to deal with Harriet now. He's never had a lady in the house before, and Lord Peter is particularly funny in dealing with the people from the village who visit the house. He has this like hilarious scene where he forgets they're not alone in the house, and he just stands by the window completely naked, and the housekeeper sees him, and then we get little snippets of her like telling her gossipy village hens all of her details about what Lord Peter looked like. The mystery plot, though, is fantastic as well. It's insanely clever and well executed. I will not spoil it for you. But there are two reasons why I have this one at number two and not at number one. One is because it is the final Lord Peter book, but it doesn't contain any finality. Now, technically, Dorothy L. Sayers did plan other books beyond this one, so it makes sense this doesn't feel like the end of Lord Peter's journey, but still, the point stands. But the bigger reason is this inconsistency in Lord Peter's character. I appreciated his relationship with Harriet in this one as I began to like it really for the first time. But the problem I have, and it is a small problem, is that all of a sudden we're told Lord Peter has like nervous breakdowns whenever the murderers he catches face justice, meaning execution by hanging. And this part of him really comes out of nowhere to me. I don't get this sense in the previous novels, and even in this book until the end. The killer in this one is like particularly an odious person. He's not really that sympathetic, although Lord Peter was, quote unquote on good terms with them, I suppose. And while I appreciated this humanizing of Lord Peter, I found it inconsistent. But I also appreciate that Lord Peter has to rely on Harriet to help him through this situation. It's a nice 180 from their initial relationship scene in Strong Poison. But again, character wise, I found it just didn't mesh with Lord Peter's character in previous novels. So I had to place Busman's Honeymoon here at number two. And at number one, what I would consider the best and my personal favorite Lord Peter Wimsey novel is one of the lesser discussed books in this series, a hidden gem of sorts, and that is The Unpleasantness at the Bellona Club, which is the only book in my top five not to feature Harriet Vane. In this novel, Sayers mixes the best of everything I want in a detective story. It has a very solid mystery plot involving the deaths of an elderly brother and his sister, neither of whom appear initially to be murdered. They both died around the same time, but it matters who died first for reasons of inheritance. And we have excellent character work in this. I love these potential heirs who are all suspects, and they each, try influencing Lord Peter's investigation into what is going on in their favor. They're trying to hatch deals, they're rejecting other deals, they don't want to hear about this deal. And this book is also extremely easy to read compared to other Sayers novels, which I often find get a little bogged down in the details and the florid writing. Most of Lord Peter's investigation takes place at the titular Bellona Club, where the general is found dead. There's a running theme of patriotism in this book, which provides several important clues, and I love these clues. I'm not going to spoil what they are, but in 1928, I think these clues would resonate more with readers than they do nearly 100 years later. So I like the element that this book is harder to solve today, but is still very possible. The Unpleasantness at the Bellona Club is such a good mix of story, character, plot, and entertainment. It does everything superiorly without having any issues. I don't have any real problems with this book. It's competent, fun, and clever. Now, if Strong Poison did not have the issue that it has, I think there is a case it would be number one over the Bologna Club, but it is a toss up in my mind. I go back and forth in my head about it, but it's all for naught because Strong Poison does have the big issue and the unpleasantness at the Bologna Club does not. So the latter comes in at the top spot here at number one. And that is it for this video. Make sure you like and subscribe to keep up to date with the channel. In the future, you can expect more rankings of every book written by certain mystery authors. I think the next one is probably going to be a ways off because I'm really getting into these authors that I have to reread and reassess much more than the ones I've already covered. I do have a great memory for these things, but I do need to review and reread quite a bit going forward. And I'm not someone who can read a novel in one sitting. It takes me a while. I'm always mulling over books as I read them, and I get distracted very easily. I have one queen of crime left to cover, Marjorie Allingham, who I think is clearly the weakest of the four, but we'll get into her eventually. Next week, I have a viewer suggested video where I will select the top 10 twists from Agatha Christie novels, so stay tuned for that. Until next time, Mystery Files.